Well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Greg Root. I'm the Director of Sales Enablement at Astadia, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Today, we'll be talking to our partner ViewDS about choosing the right approach to manage identity in the cloud. We'll spend just a few minutes introducing our speakers and then discuss why cloud identity is different and what the benefits of identity in the cloud are. From there, we'll discuss the different approaches you can take to identity as a service. We'll close with a Q&A session. As questions come to mind, please send them to me using the chat function in the GoToWebinar interface on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll stay connected as long as we need to make sure that every question is answered. Our first speaker today is John Dandeneau, Vice President of Marketing and Business Development at Astadia. John has an impressive career history in identity management. He's a former certified Banyan engineer and instructor, as well as a Microsoft certified systems engineer. In fact, John architected and deployed the first Active Directory implementation in production.
So Greg, thank you for the introduction. What he was getting at saying there towards the end is that now I lead the strategy, marketing, and key alliances effort for Astadia, including building out our cloud-burst knowledge center. Before we move on to the slides, I just want to also mention that you heard him mention Banyan. Not sure how many are familiar with Banyan systems, Banyan Vines, and of course the Street Talk back in the day was one of the earliest enterprise directories as we think about enterprise directories today. And that was back in the mid-90s. Much has changed since then, but the importance of nailing identity management remains critical to securing our systems today. What I'd like to do is start us off with a quick introduction of Astadia for those who may not be familiar with us, followed by a couple of slides to set the stage for today's guest presenter. Next slide, please. Astadia is a premier cloud consultancy that partners with our clients on this journey going through the ever-evolving technology landscape. We've been in business for over 25 years, going back to the days of mainframes and then client-server implementations, web-based applications, and now cloud computing. We have a range of services that include rapid and agile development, managed cloud services, cloud consulting and migrations, as well as the legacy to cloud modernization for a variety of mainframe types that are out there. This next slide I want to spend a few minutes on. One of our top objectives here at Astadia is to help our clients build and enable their enterprise cloud ecosystem. And I'm not talking about just a single cloud instance of AWS or Azure. The reality is that any enterprise is going to have multiple instances of major cloud vendors, as well as, of course, a lot of the SaaS vendors with their own clouds that they bring along as well. But it's about getting a handle on the totality of cloud computing and use by the entire organization without bringing innovation to a grinding halt. Now, we could do a whole webinar on just this one slide, but I want to use it here to highlight a couple of points. I think we all agree there's been a rush to the cloud, and a very recent IDG study has found that nearly 40% of organizations who have moved workloads to the public cloud have pulled some of them back already to on-prem scenarios, private cloud, and data centers because of security and cost concerns. So what was missing? Perhaps an enterprise cloud approach like we're mentioning here. The role of IT is always evolving along with technology, and recent years are no exception. We are in a position to be an agent of change within the organization, to be a partner of the business by building a flexible, safe, and secure managed enterprise cloud, and that's the item in the center there, and working to populate that with workloads from on-prem into this managed cloud, or by building integrations where a cloud migration isn't yet feasible. At the same time, IT needs to build a catalog of services that fuels innovation, whether that development is happening within the managed enterprise cloud or outside of it. The key point to take away here is whether the existing workloads or new innovation is happening in the managed environment or outside of it, IT should endeavor to provide guidance and structure around security, identity, governance, and varying levels of managed services, which brings us to today's topic, providing identity as a service to the enterprise. Identity access management, as I mentioned, goes all the way back to the 1990s when we had X500 directories, meta directories, and role-based access accounts. But today, just as then, the concern is still about properly managing identity and access. This is on top of many CIOs' lists. This is from a SANS Institute survey that found that nearly 70% of those certified identified access management as their top concern when it comes to data center and cloud computing. So what are our options for identity management in today's multi-cloud hybrid environments? That's what we're going to learn today from our guest presenter, Gil Kirkpatrick, the CTO of ViewDS. Now, Gil and I, we go back over 20 years, back to when I was working as a field engineer for Banyan, and Gil was the CTO at Trellis Software and NetPro Computing, helping build solutions back then for identity management. Gil is a recognized industry expert in identity access management. He has spoken at numerous conferences and is the founder of the Experts Conference. He's a published author and one of Microsoft's MVPs. I'd like to thank Gil for joining us today, and I warmly welcome him to the conversation. Gil.
Thanks, John. As John mentioned, I've been building identity and access related products since before we even knew identity and access was a thing. I'm currently the CTO at ViewDS Identity Solutions based in Melbourne, Australia. We develop identity infrastructure products and mostly serve organizations with high security and availability requirements, including military security agencies, telecommunications companies, and air traffic control systems around the world. My goal today is to provide some perspective on cloud identity, identity as a service, and different approaches for taking advantage of identity services in the cloud. I'll first talk a bit about how and why identity technologies have changed to accommodate the cloud, and then I'll cover some of the benefits you can realize from adopting cloud-based identity services. And finally, I'll discuss the three primary approaches to cloud-based identity as a service and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each. If you have any questions, submit them in the GoToWebinar chat window. We'll have time to answer them at the end. So before diving into why identity in the cloud era is different, I'd like to be clear about what cloud computing really means and what its important dimensions are. NIST has a really great document that they published recently which provides a set of definitions regarding cloud computing. Basically, cloud computing is a computing architecture that provides for on-demand self-service, broad network access, meaning it's accessible from anywhere, not just inside the enterprise network. Resource pooling, so that workloads can be spread across multiple machines and different workloads can share resources from single machines. Rapid elasticity, and service measurement, meaning that you know how much computing services you're consuming at any point in time. But along with this sort of general notion of cloud computing, they also describe different service models, and they describe software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Software as a service being a complete application that's delivered on a cloud platform. Platform as a service, which are components of applications or application services that are delivered in a cloud environment. And infrastructure as a service, which is fundamentally basic computing resources like virtual machines and virtual networks and storage. Along with that, the NIST document also describes four primary deployment models. Private cloud is a cloud computing delivered on dedicated resources, dedicated to a particular enterprise. A community cloud is like a private cloud, but it's shared amongst a small community of cooperating enterprises. Public cloud is cloud computing delivered in an environment that's accessible to the broad public. So that's like what you would see with Amazon and Microsoft and Google. And then finally, they talk a little bit about hybrid cloud, where you take applications and application services and actually spread them across different deployment models. If you have a chance, I definitely recommend digging up that NIST paper. It really clarifies some of the issues around cloud computing. The cloud adoption has completely changed our approach to identity services. The basic functions of identity are still unchanged. We still have to have directories to securely store attributes about subjects and resources. We still have to authenticate subjects and resources to prove their identity to the software systems. We still have to determine what operations those subjects can perform on what resources and under what situations. And we still have to maintain an audit trail to make sure we know who did what operation on what resource. But the context in which we're delivering identity now has completely changed. Identity systems like Active Directory used to live in the corporate data centers, completely walled off from the internet and walled off from anybody else who wasn't either in the office or connected up on a VPN. Now identity systems have to be accessible from everywhere, and it's not just location, but it's got to be accessible from laptops and phones and pretty much any other gizmo you can connect to the internet. One of the interesting aspects of cloud computing is the consumerization of IT, and that's had a couple of consequences on the way we deliver identity services. Consumerization has really driven convenience and ease of use factors. So where you used to have trained administrators managing IT systems, now more or less anybody else can do it, or at least they think they can. But it doesn't take much IT knowledge to go sign up for a Dropbox account and start managing a distributed file system. User self-service is also a key component of modern cloud-based identity systems. So it's not just a way for users to log on and use cloud applications. They also need a way to manage their own details, make requests for applications, and so on. And identity systems now, this isn't so much a consequence of cloud computing, but it's still an important dynamic in the industry. Identity systems aren't just for your employees now. We have to be able to scale our identity systems to accommodate employees, customers, contractors, and enterprise partners. And finally, cloud computing encourages combining applications and infrastructure services from multiple vendors. So cloud identity today has to be vendor agnostic. You can pick services and applications from the vendors that suit your needs and combine them using cloud computing, and the identity system has to be able to support that. The idea of basing your entire IT environment on a single vendor stack just doesn't make any sense at all in a cloud computing environment. Cloud technology and deployment has really changed the way we construct identity systems as well. Active Directory, for instance, although it was a replicated system, you could have multiple domain controllers all replicating happily with each other. It was also very monolithic. There is basically a single Active Directory process on a domain controller that provided all the directory authentication, single sign-on, authorization, and audit services. That monolithic approach to software architecture made the software brittle and difficult to update. Modern cloud applications are built by combining smaller services spread across multiple hosts so that each service can scale out individually and it can be modified and updated separately from the others. So that makes the entire identity system a lot more capable of handling changes in load or changes in deployment configuration or changes in features without having to take the entire system offline. And it makes the overall system much more adaptable to changing needs. Session-based protocols like LDAP don't work well through firewalls or for mobile devices for that matter. And they also don't scale very well at the server end, where you might have a server that's trying to juggle tens of thousands of simultaneous LDAP connections. So today we use stateless HTTP-based protocols instead. So for example, instead of LDAP, we use protocols like OData or SCIM for directory access. For authentication, we use things like SAML and OpenID Connect. And for authorization, we use OAuth or something based on OAuth like User Managed Access or UMA. You've probably heard of the API economy. The idea is that all cloud systems should be consumable and manageable through a set of web APIs. Legacy identity systems, like Oracle or IBM or CA, are largely configured through configuration files and scripts. Active Directory, as an example, has a proprietary RPC-based protocol for most of its configuration tasks, and everything else is configured through registry settings. So those are completely not web APIs. So today we build cloud-based identity systems so that they're manageable through web-based APIs. So you can see that even though the basic identity functions like authentication, authorization, audit, and attribute store, those haven't changed, the new operating environment has totally changed the way we build identity systems. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about why identity in the cloud era is different. I'd like to talk a little bit now about some of the benefits of adopting a cloud-based identity system. So I'll assume right now that everyone here is pursuing some sort of a cloud project, either formally or informally. And even if you aren't officially pursuing a cloud strategy, I'm pretty confident that there's someone in your organization who's using Dropbox or Jira or some other cloud service, and that will be your cloud strategy by default. Historically, the biggest concern about adopting public cloud applications has been security, and it's still listed as the primary inhibitor to cloud adoption in most CIO surveys. And the basis of security is identity and access control. Security starts with being able to identify actors and the resources that they're operating on, and defining and enforcing the policies that determine what they should and shouldn't be doing. If you look at it, shadow IT, so the idea of your employees and customers, or your employees going off and starting up their own IT services through public cloud applications, is fundamentally an identity and access control problem, because you can't identify the people who are doing it, you can't identify the resources they're using, nor can you really enforce any access control on it. So if identity is not a key component of your cloud strategy, then your strategy is half-baked, and you really need to go back and sort that out, because approaching cloud deployments without the corresponding identity strategy is a losing proposition. So everyone's pursuing some sort of cloud adoption, but it's also safe to assume that taking advantage of the cloud is not your only IT initiative. Cloud adoption often goes hand in hand with providing application access to mobile devices. It also, every IT org I know has to deal with auditor requests or cleaning up things from the last auditor's report. Your internal line of business applications probably need updating to make them easier to use or make them fit with the new employee workflows. Most organizations have projects to provide application and data access to contractors and partners, and everybody's got some sort of a customer engagement project where customers can log in and find out the status of their order, get access to product support information, or file a warranty claim, and so on. So IT organizations have lots of projects competing for time and attention. It's not just about getting stuff into the cloud. The cool thing, though, is cloud-based identity can help with a lot of those things. One of the nightmares of consuming cloud-based applications is the proliferation of accounts and passwords. This is particularly bad if you've got a substantial shadow IT activity going on that's maybe below your awareness. But every account that gets created in a cloud application is another identity lifecycle that you have to manage. It's another set of access rights you need to control, and every password is another potential vulnerability. And making users log in separately to every cloud-based application is just a terrible experience for the user, and it sort of encourages them to select cheap and easy passwords, which are easy to compromise and makes account theft even more likely. So most cloud-based identity systems provide single sign-on to cloud applications as one of their fundamental capabilities. That gives you a way to manage the accounts and access rights in one place, and it also means that the users don't have to remember multiple passwords and account names. And if you want, most cloud identity systems can also provide multi-factor authentication for certain combinations of applications and users. Because cloud-based identity systems are already outside your corporate firewall, and because they use modern cloud identity protocols, they can also support your mobile device effort as well. Most cloud identity systems have some level of user self-service so that users can manage their own details, or they can go through a ritual to reset their own passwords. That saves a ton of time and money on help desk calls. Some cloud identity systems can also provide automated provisioning and deprovisioning, so you can simplify and automate the employee onboarding and offboarding process. So instead of new employees waiting for days or weeks to get access to the applications that they need, the automated provisioning and deprovisioning provided by cloud-based identity systems can do that automatically. And when you have employees that leave, those systems can also automatically remove access for those accounts as well. So that solves the problem of dangling accounts that might provide another vulnerability. Cloud-based identity systems compared to, say, your typical on-prem identity and access deployment can also reduce capital and infrastructure costs because your cloud vendor or your managed service provider is absorbing the infrastructure costs, and from your end you're really just paying to get up and running and for whatever configuration and consulting services you need. So adopting a cloud-based identity approach doesn't just help your cloud projects, but it can actually help with a lot of other projects that you might have going on. So now that we've identified some of the benefits of cloud-based identity, I'd like to talk a little about the different approaches to delivering cloud-based identity. So cloud-based identity, by definition, is provided in a cloud environment, either public, private, community, or some combination of them. The main point is that it isn't something that you're running inside the corporate firewall. And there are really three primary approaches to building and delivering a cloud-based identity system. The first approach, I'll call it the full stack identity as a service approach, takes a mature identity and access management platform, say like IBM, Tivoli, or Oracle, or CA, and so forth, and it packages them up in a cloud environment so that it can be delivered as a service over the internet. And because these products were designed for on-prem use cases, they feature lots of connectivity with on-prem systems, and they tend to focus on provisioning, deprovisioning, synchronization between applications, integration with application infrastructure like message queues, and administrative workflows. They don't really tend to focus on cloud features like single sign-on to cloud SaaS applications. And because they were designed in the early 2000s, they also are designed to be administered by trained IT staff rather than end users. So they tend not to be very user-friendly. And most importantly, because they came from an environment where every installation was essentially a one-off. I mean, if you look at any Oracle or Tivoli installation, every one of those came with a bucket of software and a handful of consultants to install and configure the thing to suit the needs of the customer. Because they were all customized like that, there's lots of scripting and hard-coded deployment and configuration information. That makes the system very brittle, and it makes it difficult to evolve to support the changing needs of the enterprise. So every time you use one of these full-stack identity as a service products, you have to be aware that if your needs change over time, that's going to take some effort to modify the software to support you. So when would it make sense to use a full-stack identity as a service? Well, probably the most important one is if you've got lots of need to integrate your identity system with on-prem and legacy applications or on-prem application infrastructure. I think that's a place where it makes a lot of sense. Or if you have very complex compliance and workflow requirements around identity and access management, the full-stack IDaaS services support those kinds of requirements really well. And particularly if you're migrating from or expanding your existing full-stack on-prem deployment. So you already have Oracle or IBM on-prem and you're happy with that. You just want to offload the service to a managed service provider. Then I think sticking with a full-stack identity as a service product can make sense there. But probably the biggest liability to this approach is the time and money. It usually takes quite a bit of time to customize and configure and get these systems up and running, and that means money. And because they weren't designed for cloud, they weren't designed with a cloud architecture, they tend to be fairly expensive to run just in terms of the computing resources and the platform use. The second approach is public cloud identity as a service. And these are the identity services that are provided by companies like Microsoft with Azure AD, or Okta, or Ping One, and there are a few others. And these public cloud IDaaS providers are really focused on cloud applications. They're focused on users consuming web applications over the internet. The big advantage is that the effort to use them, to start up using them, is very small. I mean, you can literally sign up for Microsoft Azure AD, put in your credit card, and in a couple of minutes start adding users and connecting them up to applications. The user interfaces are generally really easy to use. These systems, these identity as a service systems, have been developed with consumerization of IT in mind. So end users will find them friendly and comfortable to use. And they all provide some level of integration with your on-prem Active Directory. One of the interesting things that I've learned about the way Microsoft is running Azure AD is they are generating an astounding amount of authentication information every day. They have millions and millions, in fact billions of authentications every day, and they're using that information to build threat models to understand the way hackers are trying to compromise people's accounts, and they're improving their internal policies and the software to mitigate those threats. So when you have a public cloud identity as a service that's being used by tens of millions of people, you get access to that kind of threat data. The downside to public cloud identity as a service is that the feature set is pretty thin. I mean, generally speaking, you get the ability to log in, you get the ability to get single sign-on to cloud applications, you get maybe a little bit of access control capability and some self-service features like self-service password reset. There's little opportunity for customization, and when you think about it, it makes sense because these public cloud identity platforms are really designed to provide identity as a service to a huge community of enterprises. So it's got to be fairly basic so that it scales well to those kinds of numbers. If they supported a lot of customization, that would drive the operating costs of the system up tremendously. So as a rule, public cloud identity as a service products don't have a lot of customization available, and there's not that much integration with your on-prem application infrastructure. The integration is usually limited to your on-prem AD, and then everything else that you want to integrate on-prem is a separate kind of effort. And finally, this is sort of a consumer purchase almost when you think about it. So your relationship with your identity as a service provider is fairly arm's length. If you've got questions, you've got a problem, you need something fixed up in some way, it usually devolves to submitting a support request on a web form and hoping that somebody calls you back pretty soon. So when does it make sense to use public cloud identity as a service? I think consuming public cloud IDaaS makes sense when you're moving to a cloud-only strategy, and your approach is basically you're going to disconnect all your on-prem infrastructure and run everything in the cloud. So you're going to focus on all your cloud SaaS apps, and in that case, doing all your identity management in a public cloud IDaaS environment makes lots of sense. Those products do a great job of managing the single sign-on connection from PCs and mobile devices to cloud-based SaaS apps. Public cloud IDaaS, I think, also makes sense if you don't want to touch your on-prem systems or infrastructure. You basically want to keep your cloud identity activities kind of separate from what you're doing on-prem, with the exception of, say, your on-prem Active Directory. In all cases, I think you have to be comfortable putting your sensitive identity information in the public cloud, and comfortable that the latency and the level of service that you're going to get from the shared infrastructure, the massive shared infrastructure that the public cloud IDaaS providers use, you have to be comfortable that that's going to meet your needs. And finally, if you haven't really sorted out your cloud strategy, but you know you want your users to use cloud-based SaaS applications, and you want to maintain control of that, then I think consuming a public cloud IDaaS makes a lot of sense because it's quick, it's easy, it doesn't require a lot of commitment on your part. I mean, you can sign up for a month, onboard a bunch of users, get them using the cloud-based applications, and if you find that that isn't really meeting your needs, or you finally sort out your cloud strategy and you want to maybe span your cloud efforts across private cloud and public cloud or community cloud, then you can sort of unwind that. It doesn't require a lot of financial commitment. So the third approach to identity as a service is private cloud identity as a service, and this is relatively less popular now than public cloud identity as a service. Public cloud identity as a service really captured the all of the small to medium organizations that said, I want to jump into the cloud right away and get rid of my on-prem infrastructure. Private cloud identity service basically is a third approach that takes the same web-focused identity services that are offered by public cloud identity as a service providers and delivering them in a private cloud environment. So there are a few vendors in this space, ViewDS being one of them. This has most of the advantages of public cloud identity as a service, including low startup effort, ease of use, and just generally a low barrier to entry. But you can get more consistent levels of service from the dedicated infrastructure that a private cloud MSP can deliver. And because you've got a closer relationship with the MSP, there are a lot of opportunities for customization and configuration to make the private cloud identity service work more effectively with your own applications. On the downside, private cloud identity as service are generally not as complete as full stack identity products. So if you try to compare a private cloud IDaaS to a full stack Tivoli or Oracle deployment, the feature set's certainly not as complete. And finally, because these deployments aren't spread across tens of thousands of enterprises like you might see with Microsoft or Okta, the MSP doesn't have the advantage of being able to analyze all of that public cloud authentication traffic to pick out all the brute force attacks that are occurring on public cloud identity as a service providers. So when does using private cloud identity as a service make sense? Well, I think if you want the advantages of public cloud IDaaS, so you want that you want to be able to control access to public cloud applications, and you want to provide single sign-on to your customers, and if you have any other needs that require a private cloud deployment, so you have applications that you don't want to run in the public cloud, or you've got regulatory requirements around where you store your identity data, then private cloud identity as a service makes lots of sense. If you have substantial customization and integration needs that can't be served by public cloud identity as a service, then private cloud identity as a service offers that kind of customization and integration capability. Or finally, if you're just not ready to put sensitive identity information in the public cloud, or you're concerned about using public cloud resources for something that's as mission critical as identity, that's another reason why you might want to look at private cloud identity as a service. And with that, I'd like to introduce Cobalt Cloud Identity from ViewDS. Cobalt is a new cloud architected identity platform that's designed for enterprise cloud identity provided through MSPs, and it'll be available soon from Astadia as a private cloud identity as a service offering. So Cobalt provides single sign-on to popular cloud-based applications and single sign-on from your on-prem Active Directory. it has an integrated attribute-based access control system that provides for delegated administration and fine-grained control over which users can use which applications and under what circumstances. Along with that integrated attribute-based access control, it also has multi-factor authentication and step-up authentication, so you can require certain users under certain circumstances to use two-factor authentication to access certain applications. Has a very easy-to-use enterprise address book. So if you have address book needs, this actually makes it much easier for users to leverage their address book. And finally, we've got a very configurable and customizable component that will sync with your on-prem applications and Active Directory and cloud systems as well, so it can take care of automatic provisioning and deprovisioning of accounts in cloud applications. Okay, so that's the end of my talk, and I guess I'll turn it over to Greg here. If you have any questions, please put them in the GoToWebinar window. Greg, back over to you.
This is John. What I'll do is, first of all, I'll talk about the offer we have here on the screen, and I think the questions, I've got a view into those. Greg can send those over to me via the chat window. Just in terms of offer, for those of you that are on the webinar here, getting into identity outside of what the cloud vendors offer or what you may be doing can be complicated, and you might want to go a little deeper dive than what we can do in a webinar here for a broader audience. So pretty straightforward offer, free 60-minute consultation with Astadia and ViewDS, and talk about your identity needs, pros and cons, walk through these models if you like, full stack versus public versus private. Just try to schedule this before the end of 2016. Reach out to info@astadia.com, and that will be where you can get in touch with us and we can set something like that up. Gil, we do have a question here, so let me pull that up and take a look at it. First one here is, can Cobalt, which is the ViewDS product, can Cobalt halt shadow IT?
Yes, it's based on very sophisticated Russian hacker technology that that senses what your users are doing on the network, and if it sees them going off to public cloud sites, it cuts them off of the network right away. Of course, I'm joking. No, it can't halt shadow IT, but it does actually remove some of the reasons for shadow IT. Shadow IT comes about because consuming cloud applications is just way easier than waiting for most IT organizations to deploy the systems on-prem. And if you give your users, if you allow your users to actually consume cloud applications and give them a way to get single sign-on to them so they don't have to create new accounts and passwords, that actually mitigates a lot of the reasons that shadow IT occurs. So if you can kind of get ahead of your users in that regard and provide them a way to consume cloud applications in a controlled way, that actually eliminates a lot of what drives shadow IT.
You know, and that actually goes back to the earlier slide we had too on the enterprise cloud ecosystem, and this concept of providing a catalog of services to empower these small teams who are out there trying to innovate on behalf of the organization. And I think identity is one of those key pieces as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you can put the identity components in place, that basically frees up the users to go pick the applications that they need, but it does it in a way that you don't lose control of it. So, like I said earlier, the idea of making identity part of your cloud strategy, I think, is critical.
Okay, great. A couple more questions that Greg is sharing with me through the chat interface here, and I'll pass on to you. One of the ones that came in: how do cloud migrations and identity management work together?
Okay, so like I said, I think identity needs to be a key component of your cloud adoption strategy. And a good way for it to work is basically using identity as a service, either public cloud or private cloud, as a way for rolling out cloud-based applications to your users in a controlled way. So as an example, if you as an IT org or your enterprise departments have settled on a particular cloud-based platform, say Salesforce or something like that, you can leverage identity as a service as a way of rolling that out to your users in a controlled way. So you can roll it out to just a few people at a time. They can try it out, and if it works for everybody, then you gradually ramp it up and you use your identity as a service system to control that whole rollout.
Okay, thanks. There's a question here that's actually a little bit near and dear to my heart, given how far back we go in the identity management world. What are some of the features that are available in the legacy identity management that might be missing from public cloud or private cloud-based systems?
So most of them revolve around integration with on-prem and legacy systems that you might be running in your own data center. That's I think where most of the features are. So for instance, web access management connectors to pick your favorite 5 web platforms. You know, that's something that you won't normally see in a public cloud identity as a service system. Or integration with IBM's message queue or Oracle's message queuing systems or something like that. If that's the kind of environment you've built your on-prem applications on, there's no easy connection between public cloud identity as a service. And generally, things around administrative workflows and detailed compliance reporting and things like that, public cloud identity as a service systems are pretty thin in that area and sort of provide the bare minimum. And if you've got more sophisticated requirements in that area, you won't find them in a public identity as a service system.
Okay. Next question. If you offer the ability to customize each enterprise, wouldn't that then cause the software to become more complicated and brittle?
Yeah, this is actually goes to the heart of the cloud architecture, using cloud architecture in the identity as a service system. And this is why I think the idea of taking full stack identity and access products and turning them into cloud services doesn't really work. The answer is yes, it does complicate things some, but if you design and architect the identity platform from the beginning with the idea that it's going to be customized, and we have this long history of full stack identity systems, so we know the kinds of customizations that people generally need, you can build that into the architecture, and cloud applications are generally architected as smaller cooperating components that are communicating over a message bus or over the network. And that lets you customize and sort of mix and match the way you configure these things in a way that doesn't drastically increase complexity. And in particular, it doesn't make the system brittle because very little is hard-coded. It's all driven off of configuration. So in Cobalt, for instance, all of the system configuration is really just driven off of APIs. So we can reconfigure and reconstitute the system in different ways just by issuing various kinds of API calls. So yeah, it does make things more complicated, but if the platform is properly architected, we can accommodate most of those customizations without drastically increasing complexity, and more importantly, is without increasing time to deploy.
Got it. If you have questions to the audience, if you have more questions, please do go ahead and use the chat interface to send those over to Greg. While we're waiting for more questions to come in, one other observation I wanted to make, that identity management, especially the ways you presented it here today, it has some downstream effects as well, and I was discussing this with one of our managed services leads the other day, and just the simple nature of simplifying the number of IDs and passwords so that you don't have that password proliferation you were talking about can then drive down the number of calls to the help desk, the number of tickets by 20% compared to just using the individual systems set up and passwords. And so just an amazing return, a quick return on something like this. Are there other benefits that you can see out there, like downstream benefits of you put identity management in place and you get some other benefits that kick in as well?
Yeah, I think the big ones are overall reduced administrative costs and reduction in onboarding time. I mean, if you've got applications that are sort of glued into your identity system through single sign-on, that gives you a really convenient way to control who has access to what. So when people come on board, they can get access to their applications right away because you only have one administrative point to deal with. Likewise, when somebody leaves or they change roles in the organization, and that's a whole other discussion, you have one point of contact with the system to basically turn off access to certain applications and turn on access to other ones. So that really simplifies the onboarding and offboarding process and keeps the whole security thing under control when that happens.
Actually, that makes a lot of sense, especially in the case we talk about shadow IT and all of these, the ease of signing up with all these SaaS applications in recent years. There's tons of user access out there. When somebody leaves an organization, it does not necessarily mean that their SaaS access has been turned off, especially if that administration of the SaaS happens outside of the IT organization.
Yeah, I've got a raft of horror stories about cloud application accounts that were left dangling, mostly because IT never knew about it, but even in some cases where they knew people had accounts because they were sanctioned, the services were sanctioned by IT, but they just didn't have control of it. And people would leave, and wow, they still have access to their Salesforce account. And wow, I can get all of the leads that I was working on before, and now I can take them with me. It's easy.
Precisely right.
It happens a lot, and when it's outside of IT's control, you're not even necessarily aware of it.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question that came in. Let me read this off to you. How does identity strategy relate to a customer's mobile device management strategy?
So the thing about mobile devices is that they're sort of tricky to authenticate. And they have high security vulnerability because they move around a lot and they get lost and stolen. So usually what you'll see is a combination of some sort of cloud-based identity system along with some sort of mobile device management like AirWatch or Microsoft's MAM. So the idea there is that the phone or tablet is just another thing that's accessing your IT resources. It needs to have an identity. And you need to be able to correlate that identity with the user who owns it. So there's always this registration process that goes on to associate a device with the user. And once you've done that, now you're removing a lot of the risk associated with this mobile device wandering off and getting stolen by somebody else.
Okay, and Gil, let me modify the question. It turns out we had an acronym crossover here. The actual question from the customer, to the participant rather, is about how identity strategy relates to a customer master data management, MDM, master data management strategy. My apologies.
So let me give a sort of half answer here, and I think I'd like to take that up offline and talk a little bit with the questioner in a little more detail. But okay. Generally speaking, in master data management, there, along with that, are a set of policies about where all the various data elements are allowed to go and how they're allowed to get used. So there's an identity and access control component associated with that needs to follow the data as it gets pushed out to different data repositories. So centralizing the access control mechanisms around the master data, I think, is an important component of that. And like I said, it's kind of a bit of a half-assed answer. So if you get a chance, I'd love to talk to the questioner about that a little more detail to understand the specifics of the situation.
Sure, and I'm sure Greg has that person's contact info, so we'll make sure that we connect the two of you to follow up afterwards.
Cool.
And I don't see any other questions in the queue that have come in. Let me just double check that. That's it. All right. Gil, any last closing comments?
No, I think I'm just very excited to talk to the people who have an interest in cloud-based identity as a service, whether it's public, private, or full stack. That's been my profession for 30 years, so I'm always love talking to people about it. So please, if you've got questions or you've got a project going on, go ahead and send an email to info@astadia.com, and let's line up a phone call, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what you're up to.
And Gil, I just want to take a second to thank you also for your time. You are, as long as I've always known you, you've just been the absolute best professional and incredibly fantastic expert on identity management, always reliable and always with all the knowledge that we need. So thank you for sharing your time with us today, all the details, and look forward to working with you guys going forward.
You're very welcome. Thanks, John.
All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.